Hello everyone. Tonight I'm taking you on a very special journey. Perhaps one of the most shocking family stories you'll ever hear. If this happened to you, you probably wouldn't survive it. Couldn't handle it, would be broken by it. So please hit the like button and subscribe. But only if you really enjoy being here with me. And hey, drop in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love knowing how far our little circle of light reaches. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some background noise and let's begin tonight's journey. For 40 years, my children thought I was an ignorant villager. I never told them I studied at Oxford, that I conducted research there, that my articles were published in international journals, because I was raised to be humble. But now that they look down on me, it was time to reveal who I really was. That night, I told them everything and made my final decision. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 68 years old and I decided to tell this story because maybe other mothers have experienced similar things. Maybe you two are being looked down upon by your children. Maybe you two have never told anyone your true worth. This story is for them, for me, and for every mother who has sacrificed their identity for their children's happiness. It all started in 1955 in a small village called Millbrook in Yorkshire, England. My father, Reverend Jonathan Carter, was the village minister, a man of few words but deep convictions. My mother, Margaret, was a traditional housewife who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher herself, but had given up those aspirations when she married at 18. Back then, it wasn't well received for girls to pursue higher education in our rural community. The prevailing wisdom was that girls should learn enough to manage a household and raise children, nothing more. Some families never sent their daughters beyond elementary school. What will a girl do with advanced education? She get married, keep house, and raise babies, they would say. But I was different from the start. I learned to read when I was just 5 years old, long before I ever set foot in a classroom. I had discovered my mother's old school books stored in the attic. Dusty volumes of poetry, basic mathematics, and simple literature. While other children my age were playing with dolls, I was sitting in corners sounding out words and trying to make sense of the magical symbols on the pages. When the village's only teacher, Mr. Richardson, noticed my unusual abilities during my first week of school, he was astounded. Here was a child who could already read at a level far beyond her years, who asked questions that showed a depth of thinking rare in adults. He immediately requested a meeting with my parents. Reverend Carter, Mr. Richardson said, "Sitting in our modest parlor, this daughter of yours is extraordinarily gifted. She's sharp, incredibly intelligent, and has an insatiable curiosity about the world. You must provide her with the best education possible." My father's initial reaction was predictable. "Teacher, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but what practical purpose would advanced education serve for a girl? She grow up, marry a good man, keep his house, and raise his children." But my mother saw something in me that even I didn't understand yet. That evening, she spoke with my father in hushed tones. "Jonathan," she said, "there's something special about this child. When I look into her eyes, I see a hunger for knowledge that I've never seen before. Perhaps God has given her a gift that we're meant to nurture, not suppress." My father was a man of deep faith, and the suggestion that my intellectual gifts might be divinely inspired gave him pause. Over the following weeks, as reports of my academic achievements continued to pour in, my father began to soften his stance. I finished elementary school at the top of my class. But more than that, I had exhausted everything the village school could offer me. For middle school, I would need to travel to the market town of Harrogate. For high school, it would mean going even further to the city of Leeds. Each transition sparked intense debates in our household. The village mayor, a progressive man named Mr. Whitmore, even weighed in on my behalf. Reverend, he told my father this girl could be the pride of our village. Imagine a girl from Millbrook making something extraordinary of herself. Gradually, my father's resistance crumbled. Perhaps it was my mother's gentle persistence. Perhaps Mr. Richardson's passionate advocacy. Or perhaps it was simply that he couldn't deny the evidence of my capabilities. High school in Leeds opened even more doors. The school was enormous with hundreds of students and dozens of specialized teachers. I excelled in every subject, but I was particularly drawn to literature, history, and educational theory. My English literature teacher, Dr. Harrison, was a graduate of Cambridge University, and he recognized in me a quality of mind that he had rarely encountered. He began lending me books from his personal collection, works of literary criticism, philosophy, and educational theory. Miss Carter, he told me during one of our discussions, you have the kind of intellectual curiosity and analytical ability that belongs in a university. Have you given any thought to applying to Oxford or Cambridge? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Oxford and Cambridge, the most prestigious universities in England, institutions that had educated prime ministers and Nobel Prize winners. Could a girl from a tiny Yorkshire village really belong in such company? Dr. Harrison spent countless hours helping me prepare my applications. When the acceptance letter from Oxford arrived in the spring of 1973, I could hardly believe it. Not only had I been accepted to read education at one of the world's most prestigious universities, but I had been awarded a full scholarship. The village response was mixed. Some neighbors celebrated this unprecedented achievement. Others worried that I was getting above myself and that too much education would make me unmarriageable. The journey to Oxford in September 1973 was the most significant voyage of my life. As the train pulled into Oxford Station and I caught my first glimpse of the famous spires, I felt as though I was entering a different world entirely. Oxford University was everything I had imagined and more. The medieval buildings, the ancient traditions, the sense of centuries of learning embedded in every stone. It was overwhelming and inspiring in equal measure. My college, St. Hilda's, was one of the few colleges that admitted women, and I was assigned to a small room overlooking a beautiful quad. My first year was challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Academically, I was well prepared, but socially, I felt the weight of my background. Many of my classmates came from wealthy families, had attended prestigious private schools, and spoke with accents that immediately marked them as members of Britain's upper classes. I spoke with a Yorkshire accent that I had never been self-conscious about before, but which now seemed to mark me as different. I learned to modulate my speech to adopt the more refined tones of my educated classmates, though I never lost my authentic voice entirely. My tutors were extraordinary. Dr. Margaret Williams, who became my thesis supervisor, was a pioneering educational theorist who had written extensively about rural education. She took me under her wing from my first week at Oxford. Miss Carter, she told me during one of our early tutorials, you bring a perspective to these discussions that many of your classmates lack. You've experienced firsthand the kind of educational challenges we discuss in the abstract. The academic work was demanding but exhilarating. I was studying educational theory, psychology, literature, and research methodology. I was particularly fascinated by rural education, how to provide quality learning opportunities to students in isolated communities. For my second-year research project, I chose to study educational opportunities in rural Yorkshire communities. Drawing on my own background, I travelled back to villages throughout the region, interviewing teachers, students, and parents. The research opened my eyes to patterns I had experienced but never fully understood. By my third year, I had found my intellectual footing. I was thriving academically, had made close friendships, and had begun to develop a clear vision for my future. I wanted to return to rural communities to teach, but armed with the knowledge and insights I was gaining at Oxford. My final thesis was titled Educational Equity in Rural Britain: Barriers, Opportunities and Innovative Solutions. It was an extensive study that combined theoretical frameworks with original research from rural communities across northern England. Dr. Williams was enthusiastic about the work. "This is exactly the kind of research that could influence policy," she told me. "You should seriously consider staying on for graduate study." I had always planned to return home after graduation. When I graduated in 1976 with first-class honours, I had several options. Dr. Williams had offered to support my application for graduate study. I had received inquiries from educational publishers. I had even been approached about opportunities in London's education ministry. Instead, I chose to return to Yorkshire to teach. "I want to bring what I've learned home," I explained. "This is where I belong, and this is where I can make the most difference." I took a position teaching at a comprehensive school in a small industrial town. The school served a working class community where many parents had left school at 14 and were skeptical about the value of extended education. My colleagues were initially puzzled by my presence. "Why are you here?" the headmaster asked me during my first week. "Because this is where I'm needed," I replied simply. I threw myself into teaching. With all the passion and knowledge I had gained at Oxford, I developed innovative approaches to engage students who had been told they weren't academic material. I created reading programs that connected literature to students' own experiences. The results were encouraging. Students who had been written off as slow began to flourish. Several of my students went on to university, some the first in their families ever to do so. It was during my second year of teaching that I met Michael Thompson. He was a teacher at a neighbouring school, a man from a working class background who had also earned a university degree and chosen to return to serve his community. We met at a regional education conference where I was presenting my ideas about innovative approaches to rural education. Michael was in the audience, and after my presentation he approached me with thoughtful questions and insightful observations. We began corresponding about educational theory and practice, sharing ideas and strategies. Our professional relationship gradually deepened into friendship, and friendship blossomed into love. We married in 1978. It was a celebration that brought together the farming families who had known me since childhood with the university friends who had become part of my adult life. Dr. Williams attended the wedding, as did several of my Oxford classmates. Michael and I settled in a small cottage between our respective schools. We both continued teaching, spending our evenings and weekends collaborating on educational projects, reading and discussing new developments in the field. In 1980, our son Henry was born. As I held him for the first time, I thought about all the research I had done on early childhood development. I was determined to provide him with every opportunity while ensuring he remained grounded in the values that had shaped me. 2 years later, our daughter Sarah joined our family. Michael and I threw ourselves into parenthood with the same thoughtfulness we brought to our teaching. From the beginning, I was determined that my children would know the value of education, but I also wanted them to appreciate the dignity of all forms of honest work. I read to them constantly, surrounded them with books, and engaged them in conversations that stretched their thinking. But I was also careful not to put pressure on them or suggest that their worth was tied to academic achievements. I had seen too many children from educated families who felt crushed by unrealistic expectations. As Henry and Sarah grew, they both showed signs of intellectual curiosity and academic ability. Henry was particularly drawn to mathematics and science, while Sarah gravitated toward literature and history. I was proud of their achievements, But I was equally proud when they showed kindness to struggling classmates. Throughout their childhood, I never spoke about my Oxford background. This decision was deliberate and I believed important. I wanted my children to respect me because I was their mother, because I loved them unconditionally, and because I tried every day to be worthy of that respect. Michael supported this decision completely. Let them know you for who you are, he would say, not for what you've accomplished. There were certainly moments when this choice was difficult. When Henry struggled with advanced mathematics, I could have told him that I had studied similar topics at Oxford. Instead, I found other ways to support his learning without revealing my background. As they grew older, my children sometimes made comments that stung. Henry, influenced by his science teachers, began to suggest that people from rural backgrounds were somehow less sophisticated. Mom, he said when he was about 16, you are fine for small-town people, but you don't really understand how the world works now. Technology is changing everything, and you've been stuck in the same place your whole lives. The irony was painful. I had been part of cutting-edge educational research at one of the world's leading universities, but my son saw only a small-town teacher who had never left her childhood community. Sarah developed similar attitudes as she progressed through her education. She was bright and academically successful, and she began to view her rural upbringing as something to be transcended. I can't wait to get away from here, she would say. I want to live somewhere sophisticated where people understand culture and ideas. These comments were like knives to my heart, but I tried to understand them as part of normal adolescent development. I hoped that as Henry and Sarah matured, they would come to appreciate their upbringing. Unfortunately, their attitudes only became more entrenched as they left home for university. Henry studied medicine at Edinburgh while Sarah read law at London School of Economics. Both excelled academically and I was genuinely proud, but their success seemed to increase their sense of superiority over their parents. When they came home for holidays, they would speak about their studies in ways that implicitly dismissed the intelligence of anyone who hadn't shared their experiences. They seemed to view Michael and me as loving but limited people. Henry, after qualifying as a doctor, was particularly condescending. Mom, he would say, medicine is incredibly complex now. It's not something people without scientific training can really comprehend. I would nod and smile, even though I had studied research methodology at Oxford and had published articles about educational psychology that drew on scientific principles. Sarah, after beginning her legal career, adopted a similar tone. Mom, the law is incredibly intricate, she would explain. It requires years of specialized training to understand how legal principles interact with social policy. Again, I would simply nod, even though I had studied education law at Oxford and had worked with solicitors on various policy issues. Throughout my career, the most painful aspect wasn't the condescension itself, but the complete lack of curiosity they showed about my life and experiences. They never asked about my thoughts on complex issues, never sought my advice on professional challenges, never wondered whether I might have insights worth considering. This became more complicated when Henry married Patricia, a woman from a wealthy London family who considered herself very sophisticated. Patricia was polite to me, but in a way that made clear she viewed me as a simple country woman. It's lovely that you've stayed in the same village all your life, she would say with a condescending smile. Some people are just more comfortable with familiar surroundings. Henry never challenged these comments. If anything, he seemed to agree with Patricia's assessment. Sarah's marriage to James, a fellow lawyer, brought similar dynamics. James was more subtle in his condescension, but the message was the same. He viewed me as a well-meaning but intellectually limited woman. The most painful moment came during one family gathering when Patricia was describing her own mother's accomplishments, her charity work, her social connections. Of course, Patricia said, glancing at me with feigned sympathy. Not everyone has had the same opportunities. Emily did the best she could with her limited education and rural background. I watched my children nod along with this assessment, apparently comfortable with Patricia's characterization of their mother as someone who had done her best despite significant limitations. The crisis came in 2018, when Michael suffered a sudden heart attack and died. We had been married for 40 years and he had been my closest friend, my intellectual companion, and my strongest supporter throughout all the years of hiding my background. Losing Michael was devastating in every way, but perhaps most painfully, I had lost the person who had helped me maintain perspective during all the years when our children's condescension had hurt so deeply. In my grief, I needed my children's support more than ever, but instead of offering comfort, Henry and Sarah seemed to view Michael's death as an opportunity to take control of my life in ways that were both patronizing and painful. Mom, Henry said during one conversation about funeral arrangements, "You're probably not thinking clearly right now. Why don't you let Patricia and me handle all the practical details?" Yes, Sarah agreed. These kinds of arrangements can be very complex. It's not the sort of thing you should have to worry about. I understood that they meant well, but their assumption that I was incapable of handling complex arrangements was both hurtful and insulting. I had been managing household finances, dealing with bureaucracy, and handling complex logistics throughout my adult life. The situation became even more painful when the time came to deal with Michael's will and our financial affairs. Michael and I had been careful financial planners throughout our marriage. We had invested wisely and built up a comfortable retirement fund. But when Henry and Sarah learned the details of our financial situation, their response was to assume that I couldn't possibly manage these resources on my own. Mom, Sarah said, "This is actually quite a substantial amount of money. You'll need professional advice about investments, tax implications, estate planning. I think you should consider moving closer to one of us," Henry added. Living alone in a rural area when you're managing significant financial resources isn't really safe. The breaking point came several months after Michael's funeral when Henry and Sarah arranged a family meeting to discuss my future. They had clearly coordinated their approach and presented me with what they considered a reasonable plan. "We've been thinking," Sarah began, "that it might be time for you to consider some changes in your living situation. Leveraging the legacy years 75 and beyond." The year I turned 75, I accepted the visiting fellowship at Oxford, a decision that felt like both a return and a renewal. When the letter arrived embossed, formal, and gracious, it carried a strange weight. For years, Oxford had been the symbol of a life I had hidden, a chapter sealed away so that motherhood, community, and ordinary love could have room to grow. Now it felt like the universe was inviting me to reconcile all the fragments of who I was when I stepped once again through the wrought iron gates of St. Edmund's College, the same cobbled path I had once walked as a timid scholarship student lay before me. But this time, my steps were sure, and the young faces that passed me were filled with the same nervous ambition I once knew. I had returned not as a student but as Dr. Emily Carter, a woman whose work had become part of the curriculum, whose name appeared in citations and bibliographies I once dreamed of contributing to. My small apartment in the college was modest but luminous, a second-floor suite overlooking the quadrangle, where the bells marked time with a soft and comforting insistence. Each morning, I opened the window to the cool Oxford air and watched students cross the lawn, their conversations trailing laughter and hope. The same walls that had once held my youthful fears now became the space where I finally felt at home in my entirety. The teacher becomes the mentor. My focus at Oxford soon turned to what I loved most, mentoring the next generation. I began hosting weekly gatherings called Rural Equity Seminars. They started informally half a dozen. Graduate students, tea, and a whiteboard covered in scrawled notes, but within months, those evenings became something of a ritual. My students, bright-eyed and brimming with theories, would present their research on rural education, digital access, and social mobility. I listened intently, always patient, then gently drew their attention to the missing heartbeat in their data. Theory is beautiful, I often told them, but the test of a theory is whether it can survive the Yorkshire classroom. Many of them came from cities, with only an academic understanding of poverty. I pushed them to travel to see the cracked floors of underfunded schools, to speak to parents whose children walked miles each morning for lessons. Slowly, they began to understand that education was not only an intellectual pursuit, but a moral one. Oxford noticed. Attendance grew, and soon even senior fellows would stop by, drawn by the energy and authenticity that filled the room. What began as a simple seminar evolved into a movement, a reminder that scholarship must serve humanity. A new purpose, the unfinished work. Dr. Williams, my former tutor, now frail but still sharp as ever, had long urged me to document my life's work. Emily, he once told me, his voice soft but insistent, you've spent decades transforming lives. Don't let your story be buried in reports and archives. At 76, I finally listened. I began writing The Pedagogy of Place, for decades of educational transformation in rural Britain. Title came easily. It felt inevitable, as if it had been waiting for me to be ready. The writing process was both exhilarating and agonizing. I wrote every morning from 6 to 10, surrounded by old notes, school inspection reports, letters from colleagues, and fading photographs of classrooms I once taught in. But the book wasn't just academic, it was intimate. I wove theory with story, a policy debate here, a portrait of a struggling student there. I wrote of children who learned resilience before literacy, of teachers who turned kitchens into classrooms during snowed-in winters, and of mothers who sewed uniforms from old curtains. The most difficult chapter was the introduction, where I confronted my decision to hide my Oxford degree and credentials from my family. For years I had believed it was the right choice to earn their love without the burden of status. But now I could see how that silence had wounded as much as it had protected. I wrote those pages with trembling hands, pausing often to weep. Yet it was necessary. It was truth. I dedicated the book to Michael, my husband, my confidant, my steady anchor. For Michael, I wrote, who believed in both my mind and my heart. When The Pedagogy of Place was finally published by Oxford University Press, the reception exceeded anything I could have imagined. Reviews called it a masterwork of lived scholarship. Teachers wrote letters saying it had renewed their faith in the profession. Policymakers cited it in Parliament, and when it won the Commonwealth Education Prize, I travelled to London to receive the award before an audience of peers, students, and family. In my acceptance speech, I spoke simply. The measure of an education system, I said, is not how high it lifts the privileged, but how gently it catches the vulnerable. Every child is a seed of possibility. It is our duty to nurture each one, whether in a city tower or a Yorkshire valley. The applause that followed was thunderous. But what moved me most was seeing Henry and Sarah in the front row, tears in their eyes, not of surprise, but of recognition. A full circle family. Henry and Sarah had grown into remarkable adults, each carrying pieces of me in their own ways. Henry, now chairing an ethics board in Leeds, often called me to discuss dilemmas that mirrored my own past, struggles with fairness in education. Mum, he'd say, sometimes policy feels like triage. How do you decide who gets what when there isn't enough for all? We'd talk for hours, exploring the parallels between hospitals and classrooms, between moral decisions and administrative ones. Sarah, meanwhile, had taken on a number of education law cases, citing my research in her court arguments. "You've become my best expert witness," she teased once. But the most profound transformation was in the next generation, Edward and Emma. Edward, in his early 20s, spent his summer holidays scanning my old manuscripts, digitizing my research for the university archives. He approached it with a reverence that both touched and amused me. "Grammar," he said one evening, holding up a yellowed page. "This handwriting looks like battle scars." Emma, younger but fiercely perceptive, was drawn more to the philosophical side of my work. She'd sit on the floor of my study, chin on knees, listening as I read her passages from my drafts. She once asked me, "If you could go back, would you still have kept the secret?" I looked at her, that blend of curiosity and compassion that defined her generation, and said, "The choice came from love, but love without truth becomes fragile." I thought I was protecting them from pride. What I didn't see was that hiding part of myself meant they could never fully know me. So no, Emma, I would not keep the secret again. That conversation stayed with her. Years later, she told me it shaped her decision to study social philosophy, truth, identity, and moral courage. A lasting peace. By the time I turned 80, life had settled into a rhythm both gentle and fulfilling. The cottage in Yorkshire had become a sanctuary once again, not of isolation, but of harmony. Students, neighbors, and family members often filled the rooms. Books lay open on the table beside teacups and half-finished crossword puzzles. I still advised on rural education policy, wrote essays, and contributed to BBC panels. But the frantic need for validation had long since quieted. I no longer sought to prove my worth. I simply lived it. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window, the same view of rolling fields that had once symbolized confinement, now radiating peace. I often thought of Michael. Gone nearly 2 decades now, his memory no longer brought sorrow but gratitude. Sometimes, when the wind carried the faint sound of children playing from the nearby schoolyard, I'd smile. My work, I knew, would outlive me in the classrooms of Yorkshire, in the voices of my students, and in the hearts of my family. Henry and Sarah visited, often not to manage me, as they once felt compelled to, but to share life. Sarah's laughter filled the cottage. Henry cooked. Edward debated Emma over the ethics of AI in education, and I watched, quietly content, as generations blended in dialogue and affection. The final integration of my life, the mother, the scholar, the mentor, the friend, was complete. I was no longer divided by roles or secrets. I had become whole. When people asked about my proudest achievement, I no longer mentioned awards or titles. These smile and say, "It's that my children see me now, not as a mother who sacrificed too much or a scholar who hid too long, but as a woman who lived fully, learned deeply, and loved fiercely." In the quiet of my final years, that truth was enough.